Imagine a world where one nation believes it can bend every country to its will, yet finds itself repeatedly frustrated by a partner too large, too independent, and too rooted in its own identity to ever submit. That is the story of the United States and India, a story not of dominance and obedience, but of pressure and resistance, of targeting and losing again and again. The geopolitical autonomy of India stands as one of the most defining factors in why the United States often struggles when attempting to pressure or target New Delhi. Unlike many nations that are heavily dependent on American support for security, economy, or diplomacy, India has historically chosen a path of independence in its international relations. This stems from its experience of colonial domination, which has instilled a deep-rooted determination to avoid being dictated to by any external power. India emerged from colonial rule with an understanding that its sovereignty could only be preserved through a policy of non-alignment. And while the global order has shifted since the Cold War, that strategic culture of autonomy continues to guide its decisions. India has avoided becoming a satellite state of any major power, instead cultivating ties across competing blocs, balancing relations with the US, Russia, China, and the wider global South. When Washington attempts to impose pressure, whether on issues of defense purchases, energy imports, or its position on global conflicts, India often withstands it by leveraging its multiple partnerships and refusing to cave under unilateral demands. Another dimension of this autonomy is India's democratic legitimacy and national consensus on foreign policy. Decisions such as purchasing oil from Russia despite Western sanctions or refusing to join US-led military coalitions are not just choices of governments, but reflect the broader strategic thinking of the Indian state. American policymakers often miscalculate by assuming that leadership changes or economic pressures can realign India's stance. But in reality, its independence is not the preference of a few individuals, but a deeply entrenched national principle. This gives Indian diplomacy a resilience that the US finds difficult to penetrate. While Washington's strategies work effectively in smaller states dependent on aid or military support, they lose momentum when applied to India because the political cost of appearing submissive to external pressure would be unacceptable to Indian leaders across the spectrum. Geopolitical autonomy is also reinforced by India's geographic position and regional role. Located in South Asia with access to vital sea lanes and bordering major powers like China and Pakistan, India holds a strategic weight that cannot be bypassed. This makes it indispensable to both regional stability and global order, further ensuring that unilateral pressure from the US cannot corner it. Every attempt to push India into alignment only highlights its unique position as a nation that cannot be coerced but must instead be engaged on equal terms. This fundamental reality is why US strategies targeting India often end in frustration, as the Indian state uses its autonomy not only to protect its sovereignty, but to elevate its role as a truly independent power in a multipolar world. India's economic resilience and growth trajectory play a central role in why it cannot be easily subdued by US pressure. Unlike many countries whose economies are overly dependent on aid or preferential trade agreements from Washington, India has cultivated a robust, self-reliant model that is increasingly intertwined with the global system on its own terms. With a massive population and a domestic market of over 1 billion consumers, India possesses an internal economic engine that shields it from external shocks. Even when the US has attempted to exert pressure through threats of sanctions, tariffs, or restrictions, India has managed to absorb the impact and continue on a path of growth. The rise of sectors such as information technology, pharmaceuticals, renewable energy, and space exploration has allowed India to diversify its sources of economic strength and reduce reliance on Western dependency. Another element that underlines India's resilience is its role in global supply chains. India is not only a major exporter of technology services, but also an increasingly significant manufacturing hub, especially as many multinational corporations seek alternatives to China. This shift has made India a critical partner for the very Western economies that attempt to pressure it, reducing Washington's leverage. When the U.S. threatened consequences over India's purchase of discounted Russian energy during the Ukraine crisis, New Delhi simply expanded its imports and rerouted trade flows, demonstrating an ability to withstand and even benefit from global disruptions. Far from being isolated, India turned into a hub where Europe, Asia, and other regions sought stable partnerships, illustrating how an independent economic path can transform potential pressure into an advantage. India's investment in innovation and digital infrastructure has made it a global leader in areas where the U.S. traditionally dominated. Its digital payment systems, space missions like Chandrayaan, and pharmaceutical contributions during the pandemic all highlighted that India is not just a consumer of technology, but also a producer of cutting-edge solutions. This independence weakens Washington's ability to weaponize technology restrictions against India, since the country has both the scale and the capacity to develop indigenous alternatives. India's young workforce, growing middle class, and increasing integration with emerging economies also ensure that its growth trajectory is not easily derailed by external interference. All of this reinforces a broader reality. India's economy is too large, too resilient, and too integrated globally to be undermined by unilateral pressure from the United States, turning every attempt at economic coercion into another demonstration of India's growing strength and autonomy. India's civilizational identity and soft power represent one of the most enduring shields against attempts by the United States to target or weaken it. Unlike many nations whose global influence rests largely on military or economic might, India projects itself through a deeply rooted sense of civilization that stretches back thousands of years. This civilizational identity, tied to philosophy, spirituality, cultural traditions, and historical resilience, gives India a unique advantage in shaping international perceptions. When Washington applies pressure on India, it often underestimates the strength of this cultural and historical consciousness that unites the Indian people across political divides. India's identity is not just about being a modern democratic nation, but also about being the inheritor of a rich tradition that places sovereignty, self-reliance, and dignity at the center of its global posture. This heritage makes India resistant to narratives of dependency or subordination, and instead allows it to assert itself as an equal in global dialogues. Soft power is another crucial dimension of this strength. India's diaspora, numbering over 30 million across the world, plays a major role in influencing global public opinion. In countries like the United States, Canada, the UK, and Australia, Indian origin communities are not only economically successful, but also politically influential. They shape debates on foreign policy, build networks of cultural exchange, and create a bridge that amplifies India's voice far beyond its borders. When the U.S. attempts to isolate or pressure India, it often finds its own domestic constituencies, particularly the Indian diaspora, pushing back against such strategies. This global presence gives India a unique form of soft resistance that the U.S. cannot easily counter. In addition, India's cultural exports, from yoga and Ayurveda to Bollywood and cuisine, create a sense of global familiarity and admiration that enhances its international standing. Unlike coercive power, soft power generates goodwill and credibility, making it harder for adversaries to tarnish India's image or justify aggressive policies against it. Even during moments of disagreement with Washington, India is not perceived globally as a threat, but as a civilizational force advocating for dialogue, development, and balance in international affairs. This is a stark contrast to how many U.S. adversaries are framed, which explains why targeting India often fails to gather international support. India's democratic institutions also form part of this civilizational and soft power identity. Despite its challenges, India stands as the world's largest democracy, which provides it with a moral authority that resonates strongly across the global South and beyond. For nations emerging from colonialism or struggling against external dominance, India symbolizes both continuity of tradition and success in self-determination. This blend of ancient heritage with modern democracy makes India far more difficult for Washington to corner. Every attempt to impose narratives of dependency or coercion clashes with India's self-image as a civilizational state and the world's democratic giant, ensuring that the U.S. repeatedly fails when trying to diminish India's standing on the global stage. India's strategy of building and nurturing partnerships beyond the orbit of the United States has been one of the most decisive reasons why Washington repeatedly fails to pressure or isolate it. Unlike countries that rely almost exclusively on American alliances for their defense or economic growth, India has carefully diversified its relationships to ensure it always has strategic alternatives. Its long-standing defense ties with Russia, for example, give it access to advanced military technology and weapons systems that the U.S. cannot easily restrict. When Washington tried to discourage India from purchasing the Russian S-400 missile defense system, New Delhi stood firm, knowing that Moscow provided it with vital security capabilities that were not easily replaceable. This refusal to bend was not just about defense procurement, but about sending a message that India will not allow itself to be locked into a single camp. Beyond Russia, India has actively built strong ties with the Middle East, Southeast Asia, Africa, and Latin America. With the Gulf states, it has secured energy cooperation, infrastructure investments, and labor ties, ensuring that its economy cannot be destabilized by external manipulation of energy supplies. With African nations, India has engaged in developmental partnerships, trade, and technology transfer, positioning itself as an ally of the global South. This makes India not just a participant, but a leader in the larger movement of multipolarity, where smaller and medium powers collectively resist unilateral domination. These partnerships dilute the influence Washington can exert, as any threat of pressure is counterbalanced by India's ability to turn to other allies for support. At the same time, India plays a central role in multilateral groupings like BRICS, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and the G20, where it advances agendas that challenge Western dominance. By pushing for reforms in global governance, trade, and finance, India positions itself as a representative voice for countries that feel sidelined by U.S.-centric institutions. When Washington tries to isolate India diplomatically, it often finds that such attempts backfire, as India's participation in these alternative blocs enhances its legitimacy and gives it a platform to resist. Even with countries like Japan, France, and Australia, close allies of the U.S., India has cultivated strong bilateral partnerships that operate independently of Washington's dictates. This web of relationships means that India cannot be cornered without causing rifts in the broader global order. Every effort by the U.S. to apply pressure only reinforces India's determination to expand these partnerships further, ensuring it remains a pivotal power that cannot be subdued. This ability to balance and diversify alliances is a strategic shield that frustrates American efforts, making India's position in global politics not one of vulnerability, but of calculated strength and resilience. The repeated misjudgment by the United States of India's role in the global order has been one of the key reasons why its attempts to target or pressure India consistently fail. Washington often approaches India with the same tools it uses on smaller states, assuming that diplomatic isolation, economic pressure, or security threats will be enough to bring compliance. What it fails to grasp is that India's foreign policy is not just a reaction to immediate pressures, but is rooted in centuries of historical experience, including colonial domination and decades of Cold War balancing. This history has given India a unique strategic culture that prizes autonomy, resilience, and long-term vision over short-term concessions. When the U.S. overlooks this reality, it repeatedly underestimates both India's ability to resist and its determination to chart its own course. A major misjudgment lies in Washington's tendency to view India primarily through the lens of great power rivalry with China. While the U.S. sees India as a potential counterbalance to Beijing, New Delhi sees itself as an independent pole, not a junior partner in someone else's strategic agenda. When American policymakers pressure India to align more fully with anti-China coalitions, India resists because it refuses to be drawn into binary conflicts that compromise its own sovereignty. This misreading leads Washington to assume India is hesitant or indecisive, when in reality India is acting with deliberate caution to protect its broader interests. Such assumptions often backfire, as U.S. frustration turns into accusations of unreliability, further widening the gap between the two sides. Another aspect of miscalculation is the American tendency to ignore Indian public opinion. In a democracy as large and diverse as India's, foreign policy is not shaped in isolation by elite decision-makers, but resonates deeply with popular perceptions of sovereignty and national pride. When the U.S. attempts to dictate terms, it fuels nationalist sentiment in India that strengthens resistance rather than compliance. For example, when Washington threatened sanctions over India's energy imports from Russia, it underestimated the strong domestic consensus that India must secure affordable energy regardless of external pressure. Instead of pushing India towards submission, such threats only reinforced its resolve to act independently and exposed the limits of U.S. influence. The U.S. also often misreads India's regional and global aspirations. India does not see itself merely as a South Asian power, but as a civilizational state with a rightful role in shaping the global order. Every attempt to restrict or diminish India's influence clashes with this self-perception and encourages India to pursue even greater activism in global forums. By misjudging India's identity, Washington continually designs strategies that fail to account for its depth of ambition. In this way, U.S. targeting not only fails, but paradoxically strengthens India's independent stance, pushing it further toward shaping a multipolar order that reduces American leverage worldwide. The rise of multipolarity and the decline of unilateral power form the broader global context that explains why the United States repeatedly fails in its attempts to target India. For decades after the Cold War, Washington operated within a unipolar framework where its influence could shape the political, economic, and security decisions of most states. But the global balance of power has undergone a fundamental transformation, and India has been one of the central actors accelerating this shift. Multipolarity means that no single power can dictate terms to the rest of the world. Instead, multiple centers of influence exist, each capable of balancing the other. India, with its vast population, rapidly growing economy, and strategic location, has positioned itself as one of these poles. Whenever the U.S. tries to exert pressure, India can turn to other partners such as Russia, China, or even middle powers in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, reducing the effectiveness of American leverage. The Ukraine conflict illustrated this reality with striking clarity. While Washington attempted to build a coalition to isolate Moscow, India refused to cut ties with Russia, continuing to purchase oil and defense equipment. Far from being isolated for this stance, India emerged as a bridge between the West and the rest of the world, hosting dialogues and maintaining credibility with both sides. This is the essence of multipolarity. India does not have to choose between blocs, but instead uses its position to balance them, increasing its own influence in the process. U.S. policymakers, accustomed to smaller states bending under pressure, discovered that attempts to target India only highlighted America's declining ability to enforce unilateral rules. Multipolarity also plays out in the economic sphere. Global supply chains are no longer dominated solely by the West, and new institutions like the BRICS New Development Bank and alternative payment systems are challenging the monopoly of Western financial mechanisms. India is actively involved in building these frameworks, ensuring that if Washington attempts to apply pressure through traditional financial tools, alternatives exist to cushion the impact. Each attempt by the U.S. to use its traditional instruments of power pushes India and others to invest further in multipolar institutions, accelerating the erosion of American dominance. In the security domain, India's participation in both U.S.-aligned initiatives like the Quad and in organizations that include U.S. rivals demonstrates how it is navigating this multipolar world on its own terms. By not being locked into any one alignment, India avoids dependence and ensures it cannot be coerced. The U.S., however, still often acts as if it is operating in a unipolar environment, miscalculating its influence. This disconnect is why its strategies against India repeatedly collapse. The more Washington tries to assert unilateral dominance, the more India leans into multipolar partnerships, reinforcing a global order where American attempts at coercion lose their effectiveness. In this new reality, India's rise is not an exception, but a confirmation of the decline of unilateralism, making it impossible for the U.S. to succeed when it targets India.